We're here today to connect as Wyckoff cousins and share our history and experiences. We hope these calls create community among Wyckoffs everywhere. And we have a special guest with us today, an author. Our guest today comes to us from Sweet Home, Oregon, where she is an educator teaching history and English to junior high students. Ms. Holden has recently been interviewed by the New Amsterdam Historical Society. You'll find the recorded video interview on their website, and was recently selected to participate in the Oregon Historical Society's Holiday Cheer event. Catalanja Tricot, A Life in New Amsterdam, is her first historical fiction novel. She did extensive research over 8 years, reading more than 100 books, articles, periodicals, primary source documents, and maps, piecing them together to create this delightful and insightful story of life as a woman during the earliest days of New Amsterdam. We are so appreciative to have this wonderful glimpse into what life would have been like for our own great-grandmother, Griet van Ness Wyckoff. Please join me in welcoming Lana Holden. Round of applause. Yes.
Thank you for inviting me here today. As was mentioned, I live in Oregon, so I don't often get to talk about New Netherland to a lot of people. As was mentioned, I just wrote my first novel. It didn't just do it. It took me about 8 years of a lot of research, trying to figure out how to do this correctly. With the things I studied, I originally planned to do a history book about Catalanja Tricot. And as I studied about her, I just thought, oh, she's way too awesome. She has to be historical fiction. She can't just be, another history page. And so I wrote the book. I changed it to historical fiction. A lot of people who have read it have said that it is so historically accurate. They don't like calling it historical fiction, so they've called it a historical novel, which I take a compliment in that. But there was a lot of research that went into this. I just have a few things I'll talk about here today. And then if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. And Lisa and Melissa will go through those and we'll try to answer them as they come. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Catalanja first. I don't know if Catalanja and Griet ever met each other. They were in some of the same locations. So Catalanja was in Hanuut, Belgium, as a 16, 17-year-old. And then she ended up leaving because of the Spanish Inquisition. And so she went up to Amsterdam, which is where her half-sister lived. Her and her younger sister traveled up there just by themselves. They made it to Amsterdam. They found their sister. And then things kind of changed. Her younger sister fell in love with the brother of her husband. And so she married rich. But Catalanja fell in love with an illegitimate orphan, Joris Jansen Rapalje. And so they fell in love 4 days after getting married. They got on a ship and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the Dutch colony of New Netherland. That would be a brave thing to do. Once they were there, they settled in Fort Orange, which is up north, kind of by, Rensselaer, where Griet was at. They were there for some time, for about 3 years. They worked hard. They established a place to live. They did everything they could. They planned on staying there for a very long time. But then there were troubles between the Mohawks and Mohicans. And so the leaders of the colony said, you need to come down south. You need to come down to New Amsterdam where we can keep you safe. And so they did. They moved in August. They would have had to leave their house that they'd worked on, all the land they had cleared, all their gardens and everything to prepare for winter. And they settled in New Amsterdam. After New Amsterdam, and while they were in New Amsterdam, they ran a tap room. Her and her husband ran a tap room. And then they purchased land on what's called the Wallabout, which is, across the East River or the Oust River. And that would have been near where Griet lived. their land was kind of by the Brooklyn Bridge, the Brooklyn side of the Brooklyn Bridge. They owned about 300 acres. So they were kind of neighbors. They would have experienced, I think, a lot of the same things. With my book, I focused on women, the women of New Netherland. So in writing this, I mention a lot of the famous people. I mention a lot of the events, but I keep Catalanja at the center. She's always the one that we focus on. Every Everything in the book is from a woman's perspective. So sometimes you're seeing things that happen to her daughters, to her, to the midwife Trin, who she knows well. And there's it's from a woman's perspective. I wanted it to be that way. Even when I mention couples, I will mention Catalanja and Joris, not Joris and Catalanja. So I keep it just, focusing mostly on the women. And not that these other people weren't important. The men were important, the leaders were important, but I wanted to keep it just um, focused on Catalanja. When we look at like just the way men and women are, they're different. And there's nothing wrong with that. The men in events are going to be doing things and planning things, and the women are doing that as well, but they are also the ones that care deeply for those who are around them. And so they are going to be the ones who will, care for the children, worry about food. They have a lot on their plate, so to speak. So thinking of some details that Catalanja experienced, which Greet, I'm sure, experienced as well, just the way things were back then. First would be women giving birth. So obviously, the women are the ones that give birth, but in today's world, if you're going to have a baby, you go to the hospital, they help you out, you have the baby, you're done. For the people, the women in New Netherland, they had to have babies just with their friends helping them, or hopefully they had a midwife. So to do that, you would have to make connections with people beforehand, and just say, I'm probably going to have my baby sometime the end of June. If I can be sure to send my husband or my son on horseback to come and get you and help me at this time. There would have to be a lot of trust and a lot of love and a lot of caring to do that for each other. They didn't have, Tylenol, ibuprofen, all that kind of stuff, but they did have herbs that they knew would curb, stomach aches or headaches or even pain in labor. And so again, it's not like, well, let me run to the store and get, the medicine I need. You'd have to have grown that in your garden and had that, and you had the herbs dried, know how to make the tea for it. There would have to be a lot of understanding. Again, a lot of preparation and helping each other. As we know, babies don't come like between 9 and 5. They come whenever they're ready to come. And so part of that would have been very difficult for them, for the women, because if someone rides up to your house at 2 in the morning and said, your neighbor, this woman who you said you would help when she had a baby, she's having the baby and she needs your help right now, please. And so as women, whether it was Catalanja or Greet or any other woman in New Netherland, they're going to gather their bag that they had probably kept, ride a horse or walk through the forest, the dark forest. There's going to be wild animals. They're going to have a little lantern. They're not going to have a really cool headlight. They're not going to have Gore-Tex jackets or anything. It's just going to be them in their long skirts going through the dark to go help a friend. And also when they left, their husbands would know they were leaving, or maybe their older daughters. They would leave their family in charge, but they would have to really prepare to make sure there was enough food left for the family members, make sure they'd be taken care of, because when they went to help a friend have a baby or a family member, they would stay maybe for 2 or 3 days, depending on the condition of the woman. If she had a lot of children already, the woman who went to help might stay and clean her house or harvest her garden or take care of her children or make meals. And usually at night, they'd just sleep on the hearth, sleep there by the hearth. They didn't really have an extra room for anyone to stay in. There would be no way for them to text their husband and say, "Hey, I'll be back in 2 days." It just had to be, well, I'll be back when I'm finished helping my friend. And so that's just a different perspective, even for those of us who are women right now, to try to deal with that. Thinking about weddings as well, women are going to have to do the sewing, the meal preparation for a wedding meal. They would help with getting things like today we have, showers and stuff for people who are getting married, but the women are going to make everything that that girl would need when she gets married so that she could have her own household. And this would be, again, a lot of preparation. Also, if she had mostly older daughters, then that's a big loss of help to her own home that she would not, she wouldn't have access to that. Um, Food would be another thing. You couldn't just say, I've had a really long day, I'm going to throw frozen pizza in the oven. There's no fast food. The only food you have is what you can grow or what you can trade at the market on Thursdays. So
Yeah.
that's be worrisome.
I just wanted to comment because you just talked about marriages, and I was surprised how early people got married. Thir
Yeah,
13. That's really young.
that's really young. Yeah, and Catalanja's oldest daughter got married when she was 13. Yeah. And so, yeah, think about preparing your daughter, yeah, for that. A lot of times too, they would get married and then they might not move in together until they had a house established. So the husband had to have a house or and all the supplies, or else the new wife might just move in with the in-laws and live there until they could establish their own house, which is kind of a different thing as well. Yeah, they did get married very young. And then, one thing, like Catalanja had 11 children. I know Greet had 11 children as well. So that's just, I don't know, thinking about like preparing your daughter to be a farmer's wife or a business, helping run a business and raise 11 children. It's just while you're raising your own kids. Because when Catalanja had, I think, about 5 children was when her first daughter was married and started having children of her own. So the last half of her family was born concurrently with her daughter's children, which would be another interesting view there. I think women would worry more about food, for their family. They're going to be gardening, they're going to be preserving food. So again, in the book I wrote, I talk a lot about worrying about food. Thinking about when Catalanja came over here, she didn't know what it was going to be like to grow food in New York. She'd never been to New York. No one had written any books about how to grow food there. So she would have had to just hope that the season would be good enough that she could provide for her family.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat here. Were
Yes.
marriages with courting and wanting the wedding? Becky, feel free to chime in if I didn't capture that correctly.
You did.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think they did I think they did court. Yeah, there weren't assigned marriages because again, this is a Dutch colony, so they have a lot more freedom than the English colonies or Spanish colonies. So they were allowed to choose. I think they knew it was necessary that they marry to survive. Um, but yeah, it's very young to get married. I teach junior high and I cannot imagine them being married. They're 13 years old. I'm like, oh, that's a scary thought.
Uh,
Are there
well,
any other questions right now?
yes, it seemed like, and I'm reading the book also, Cheryl, I love the observation. I was wondering that myself. It seemed like they were primarily vegetarians, as you're mentioning. They ate a lot of vegetables.
Yeah, they did eat because that's what they could grow. And I think some of that comes just because the men would be hunting. I mean, obviously they're going to hunt deer and rabbits and whatever they have around there. So I focus more on what the women were doing. The women would be gardening, they wouldn't be out hunting. And so that's why it seems like they were vegetarians, but they had meat as well. That's a good question. Again, just trying to focus on the women. It was really hard because I had so much information. I think the book ended up being 103,000 words. And I originally, when I finished the first edit, it was 168,000 words. So I cut a lot out, just trying to keep it, focused on Catalanja instead of having it just be a history of New Netherland, because that makes it more intimate. But yeah, the vegetarian thing, it does kind of maybe seem like that. One thing that was interesting in my original manuscript, I at one point I had her adding potatoes to a stew, because a friend came over to eat with them. And my editor, who is she lived in the Netherlands and she's in New York and knows all about Dutch history, she said they didn't have potatoes back then. So I had to cut all the potatoes out of my story. I'm like, oh no, I didn't realize that. So little details like that, you just kind of, I learned a lot, stumble onto those. Any other questions before we go on?
Yeah.
Yes.
Karen.
Me?
Karen.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was, because my name doesn't show on here, so I don't know if you could see it was me. I was just wondering what your primary resource was for just the little bit of Dutch New Netherland history that you gave us, for those of us who would like to look more deeply into everyday life.
I read so many things. I do have a bibliography that I'm willing to share with you of all the
Okay.
different, because there were articles, there were websites, there were maps, there were land deeds, there were books old, there were books new, I found many things. So yeah, if Melissa or Lisa would just remind me, I can send them my
Okay.
list, and then you can have access to all of it.
Thanks, because I was an historian, so anything I read, I'm always, where are the footnotes?
I know. Yeah. Well, and
where are my
my
footnotes?
yes, and my original manuscript had all the footnotes, but my editor said, well, if it's historic fiction, then you don't put those in there. So I'm like, okay. So I kept them, like I said, on a separate document because that was a lot of research, and
Yes.
I'm a historian too, and so I just, because whenever I read a history book, I think, is that true? Historical fiction, did they make this up? Is this? And so yeah, I get where you're coming from because I want it to be right as well.
There's a question, how were children educated?
Um, so women got to learn. Dutch women got to learn. English women, no, they were just supposed to stay home. But Dutch women, in the old world and the new world, they expected them to learn and to go to school. And they would learn their numbers, they would learn reading, they would learn the Bible, those sorts of things. Now, Catalanja was actually illiterate when she came over here. There's evidence that she did learn to read because she kept the books for the tap house, that she and her husband had. But they had schools. I think it took probably about 10 years to get some schools established because when they first moved there was nothing. Like Catalanja's first winter, they got to Fort Orange and there were no houses. They had, and from April until it got cold, to have gardens made, to clear the land, to build buildings, and seems so overwhelming to me. But once they got, and it started in New Amsterdam, that they had a school. And if you look at those old pictures, the maps, there's a city hall and there's a church and there's a school in there. So they were educated, they'd go to school mostly in the mornings, but it was mostly those three subjects that they would learn.
Mm-hmm. There's another question. Did your research lead to know about any other stories or individuals you'd like to know more or write more about?
Yes, there's so many amazing people there. Her oldest daughter, Sarah, is just phenomenal. But there's actually another woman writing a book about her that I've been helping edit her stuff. So that will be coming out, I think, next year. She still has some work to do on it. But she wants it to come out next year. Trin, I love Trin. Trin was the midwife. She was about 20 years older than Catalanja. But when I studied the Castello plan map, they lived just like 5 houses were in between them. And if you have 11 children, you're going to be friends with the midwife. So I did research, but they have a friendship in the story. And I love Trin. She's one of my favorite characters. There were other, well, characters. I mean, she's a real character, but real person. Yeah, there were other people I would like to to write about. And actually talking with Lisa about Greet, I'm like, wow, she sounds really cool. I could maybe learn more about her and write about her. And I did a little bit of research just to find out about her so I can compare her to Catalunja. But there's so many, fascinating, strong, determined women that it just it's inspiring to me to read and learn about those. Because the
Well,
more you learn, then the more you realize that you want to learn. So yeah,
there's a question from Doug. Did they build a church first?
they did. Yeah, so the Dutch West India Company were the ones that established the colony. And it wasn't run by the church, but the church was a major part of the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam. And so they did build it at the first. Um, the church, the Dutch Reformed Church, they took care of widows, they took care of orphans. So they were kind of like a government welfare sort of thing. I mean, they were awesome in how they took care of everyone. So all the monies they gathered, they would help people who needed. So that was established first so that they could help, those who needed help first. And then, kind of figure out, well, how many schools do we need? Where do we need them? And then, of course, there are all these other things, wars and stuff going on that they had to deal with as well.
Yeah. Another question. What was Trin's full name?
Oh, I don't remember. It's like Van Masterland, I think. I don't remember for sure. She came though she was a widow. She came over with her daughter, yeah, her daughter and her son-in-law and three grandchildren. So she just thought, well, I bet this colony needs a midwife, which they did because they didn't have one. And this was probably 4 or 5 years into the colony's establishment. So she kept very busy. But she died before, Catalanja because she was like 20 years older. But yeah, she
Mm,
seemed like a really good woman.
mm, cool. What's some other questions for now?
Okay, I'll continue on. So one thing I did, oh, I see one more hand.
Yeah. I'm
Oh,
sorry, I'll look up Trin's name while we're talking, but I was very impressed that you were able to document women's independence and standing in the community. There was a book a few years back that I read about how Dutch women were allowed to own businesses, their own property, and I found it, the women plural of the house by Jean Zimmerman, and it is the same time period roughly because it takes you up to when the British took over and said women are now property.
Yeah.
So Catalanja went to court and
Mhm.
sued successfully.
Yeah.
And then she protected the orphan when the church was going to take the property. And she managed to protect that child's property. So you had examples of women having their own property and their own civil rights. So
Yeah.
yay.
Yeah. Thank you for noticing that because that's something I explicitly wanted to have in there because, when I teach my junior high kids, I teach world history and US history. And so I teach a lot about the Dutch. My youngest son always teases me and said, "You're teaching about the Dutch again today, aren't you?" And yes, I am. But
Yes.
I like to compare because, the English women, they didn't have rights. They had to go, when they were in town, they had to have their husband with them. If they were talking about community affairs, they just fold their arms and look down because they weren't smart enough to have a conversation. They didn't need to go to school. And if their husbands died, they had to give the land, like their whole homestead that they had worked their whole lives on would go to an uncle or a son, and then they usually let
Mm-hmm.
them stay there. But yeah, the Dutch women,
Mm-hmm.
they
And even if they brought in their own property to the marriage, the
yes,
women still lost it when their
yeah,
husbands died.
yeah. And I do have some nuances too once the colony is taken over of, Catalans are kind of mocking some of the English people that are talking and
Mm-hmm.
and just say, well, I can do this and I can do that. And even till the end, I have her just very much, Dutch that she
Yeah.
valued. Yeah, there were Dutch women that ran international businesses, and the Dutch usually have
Mm-hmm.
3 jobs at a time. Sometimes they would help each other, like the husband and wife would have a business and the woman would have a business and the man would have another business. But sometimes women would be the ones that would sail back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean
Mhm.
while we're, farming. So
Yeah, I think that's in this book. I don't know. That doesn't really show up.
so
It's
tell
The Women of the House by Jean Zimmerman. And there are examples of real women who owned their own businesses and had international trade.
yeah,
But I read it like 10 or 15 years ago. So I
I'll-
can't remember. But I'm gonna put it in the comments so people can look it up.
thank you. Yeah, you can never have too many books to read, so that's
Exactly. Especially women books.
yeah. Well, and that's too why I kept the women's perspective, because they could do a lot of things. The men could do a lot of things, and we're expected to do a lot of things.
Yeah. They were
Yeah,
called she merchants.
yeah,
SHE. She merchants.
fun. Yeah, I will
Yeah.
read. Thank you. Any other questions or comments so far? Okay, thanks for putting that in there.
Yeah.
So one thing I did is like I said, I am not an expert on Greet, which I would like to become an expert on Greet. She's intriguing to me. Um, so I kind of did some comparing and contrasting with Greet and Catalanja, because I know you're all here because you love Greet, but Catalanja is wonderful too. But I think they had some things that were similar. So for one thing, when they both came to the colony, they both lived up north, different places, but that's where they started out, was up near, Albany, New York. They both had 11 children, which that's a lot of children. Um, Greet died in her 70s, I think. Catalanja died in her 80s. So that's old in today's world, but to live that long with no Tylenol or ibuprofen or doctors even, because women's health was very taboo. You weren't, that wasn't anything you were supposed to study. So it's amazing. They both had husbands that started out very poor, because my understanding was Greet's husband was an indentured servant, doing what he could to get over here, and Catalanja's husband, like I mentioned, was an illegitimate orphan he knew how to weave cloth. So so they didn't really have a powerful beginning. Both of them were widowed. Um, Catalanja was widowed for 28 years. She never remarried. She just kept going strong on her 300 acres. And I think Greet was she widowed for about 10 or 15 years, 12 years maybe. I'm not certain on that, but that it's a chunk of time that she was there by herself. Catalanja, I was looking, Catalanja, when Catalanja was 47, Greet was 26. So there's about a 20-year difference. So even though they were neighbors, I mean, they still would have helped, depended on each other. And I like to think that they would have met each other at some point too, because they both seem like really interesting women. So when Catalanja came over, when she crossed the East River and lived in what's now Brooklyn, that's when Greet was living. She lived in Flatbush, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I was learning about her. So which that is southeast of where Catalanja lived. Now, Catalanja had about 300 acres. She had kids that had a couple hundred acres by her, but they were in the same area. They really could have crossed paths, which I'd like to, I don't know, kind of look into that. One thing, there was a 20-year difference in their age, but there wasn't a division of, oh, you're just older, so I'm not going to hang out with you, or oh, you're too young, I'm not going to hang out with you. Women helped women. Women had to depend on each other, living in this colony. And so age would not matter. They would have appreciated each other's help. As I mentioned, Trin was about 20 years older than Catalanja, but they were good friends. They were neighbors. They would have helped each other.
Mhm. Question from Doug is, was farming done with hand tools only?
Yeah, and actually I think it was the first 2.5 years, they didn't even have animals there yet. So I don't even know. I mean, I tried to imagine. I wrote it in my book. like how do you clear the land? Some primary source documents say that some of the trees were so close together in New York that you could not walk between them. And that's just, I mean, there were Native American villages, but there were really thick forests, and that's where like Fort Orange was. That's where Beavervike, Rensselaer, they were all in these really forested areas with just tiny, well, not tiny, but towns around for natives. And like I said, there were no animals. They brought animals over after about 2.5 years. They brought them on 3 ships, one called the cow, one called the sheep, and one called the horse. And so Catalanja was really excited when they actually had a horse to help plow. But I don't know. I honestly still don't know, even though I wrote about it. How would a 18-year-old and a 19-year-old who had never worked like hard physical labor, I mean, they were tough people, but how would they, just those two work the two-hand saw and clear off land? And like I said, they had from April till June. And so you had to save some of that lumber to burn for the winter, which is going to be green. Um, you have to build a house. You have to clear a place for a garden and hopefully get enough food for the winter because you don't know what the winter is going to be like because you hadn't been there. There were so many questions that they would have had. It would have been just exhausting, exhausting work. But they did it. But again, you'd want, yeah, they were very glad for the animals. Animals also provide fertilizer, manure to help your plants grow better. And that was one thing. The Dutch were really good about that in the old world because there's a lot of cattle and dairy farming. So when they came here, they didn't have the fertilizer that they were used to in the old world until the animals till they got the animals over here. And again, that would be a wild shipwreck. Can you imagine crossing the Atlantic Ocean with a bunch of cows? I just don't even know how that would how that would be. I've imagined lots of these things. I'm like, how really did it go down?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's interesting.
A question from Dave Wyckoff. Did they have interactions with the natives? And yes, certainly. I'm reading the book, and there's plenty of that. But please go ahead and
Yeah, so when they got on the ship, they told them before they left, they said, you have just a few duties to do. We will give you land and stuff and help you to survive, but you have to get along with the natives. Whenever I'm teaching my seventh graders, I'm like, why would they tell them to get along with the natives? And it's because you are surrounded by millions of natives, so you have to get along with them. They will take you out rather quickly if you don't. They said another thing you have to do is you have to trade. You have to work in the fur trade with the natives because that's how the Dutch West India Company was going to make their money, was with the fur trade. They didn't train them on languages. They didn't train them on how to communicate with the natives because they didn't know in Amsterdam. And so that was one thing they were required to do. And then again, going back to differences between the English and the Dutch, when we see interactions with the English and the natives, they're very, very standoffish with the natives because the natives have a different color skin. The natives are not Christians, so it's like we really don't want much to do with you. That's, you can convert, or we really, we'll trade a few things, but we're not really interested in doing much with you. Dutch came from a very welcoming, tolerant society, because everyone in the Spanish Inquisition had gone to the Netherlands to for protection. So they were more welcoming, more open-minded. And so with their interactions, they would actually let the natives in their homes. It didn't phase them. Yes, they weren't Christians. Yes, they didn't, different color skin. Yes, they spoke a different language, but it's like, yeah, you're a person. Just what can I do to help you? Natives might come with a bunch of furs one night to trade, and it might be a cold winter night. And so the Dutch would say, you can just sleep on our floor and go home in the morning, or don't want you being cold. They had to set laws in New Netherland because they were too nice to the natives, because they were baking too big of loaves of bread to trade with them. And they were baking a lot of cookies to trade with them too. And so it sounds really nice, but it's like, we have to set a law here because you're going to run out of flour for the winter if you use it all, being nice to the natives. So So that was a thing there, but there were many interactions, and it's sad to me to see how it deteriorated, mostly because of the Keef Indian War. Things deteriorated, and obviously, you know, they were slowly kicked off their land too, which is not, I don't know. I don't like that part of history. I'm not sure how else it could have gone down,
Yeah. Do
but
you want to
it's
say a little bit about the Keef Indian War? Because it's interesting. It's what drew your attention to this person, and it's part of history that I'd never heard of either.
yeah.
And
Yeah, so that was one thing actually that I had written down, that both Greet and Catalanja, Catalanja experienced, but Greet would have experienced it too. So what happened is Willem Kief was one of the director generals to come and lead New Netherland. He had a lot of experience with business in the old world. He had never been to the New World. He had no experience leading any group, so he just kind of walked onto the scene. And he was very hateful. He was not like the others. He was not welcoming to minorities. He detested the Native Americans. And so his poor leadership just is heartbreaking, what he does to that colony. There's a lot of deaths. What he begins by just saying, I think we need to charge taxes. We need to charge the natives taxes because we're protecting them. And so the men that we're working with, and one of them happened to be Catalanja's husband, because he had a council of 12 men that he had chosen. And he said, and so his council was saying, sure, what we're protecting them from, they're doing okay on their own. They help us, we help them. And but he said, no, we need to charge them. And so then he waited until like people were busy with things, and so he got a following, and they went and attacked the natives. They just went and destroyed them and killed them in their villages one night. Surprise attack, really, for no reason except for that he wasn't getting the attention that he thought he deserved. They weren't grateful to him, they weren't paying him taxes, and so it becomes this 3-year war that's just devastating to the entire colony. If you look at pictures, there's one picture, there's a windmill at the one end of by the fort, by New Amsterdam Fort. And there's one painting that the windmill is broken, just the fins of it are broken down. And that was after the Key Four. People were just doing what they could to survive. And so the natives, of course, got very violent because it was their land to begin with. And they were just being needlessly attacked. So there was lots of violence on both sides, lots of hunger, lots of deaths, destruction of property. It was horrible. And that all happened while Catalanja lived in New Amsterdam, which was the center, um, the center of things. So thinking about, again, from a woman's perspective, the men, of course, are going to worry about fighting. They're going to worry about shelter, which is fine. But think about the women who, like, if you had 5 little children, how do I keep these kids calm? There are people killing each other in the streets in front of my home. How do I keep them protected from this? How do I get them food? I can't go outside to get the food for my garden because, we're under constant attack. Oh, the house beside us just burned. How do I keep my children calm? How do we, again, food? How do I help my neighbor? I know she's expecting a baby this month. Can I check on her? When would be a safe time? Kids crying in the night. How come it smells like smoke? Why is everyone screaming in the middle of the night? I can't sleep. I'm scared. So those would be things that the women would have to deal with, in that war. And there's, like I said, it was heartbreaking because it never went, the relationship between the natives never did go back. Keef was hauled off back. They started writing letters. The settlers started writing letters back to the Dutch West India Company saying, we've got to get rid of him. He is destroying our life. This is where we chose to live, and now we can't
did you
exist.
come up a question in the chat here from iPhone? I'm not sure who that is. Did you come across any information giving you insight into why this leader was chosen? Why was Keith chosen?
Well, because I mean, he had led. I mean, he had led some things. He was well educated, in the old world, but he was more interested in himself. I don't know. I wonder if, it could have been just money. Um, but he was interested in getting attention to him for himself. He wasn't interested in really helping people. He just wanted to be the center of attention.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
Portuguese.
Cheryl just points out that Catalanja lost a son during the Kieft War also. Was it Jacob? Was it
Yeah,
that
yeah,
she
Jacob. Well,
Jacob?
Jacob. Yeah, I still, some people have asked me if I would, because I want to do an audiobook. And they say, oh, it'd be really cool if the author read it, but there's some parts in that book I still can't read without crying. I'm just like, oh, and that's one of them, thinking about, okay, how would I for that? And again, looking at, mothers and how we feel towards our children. There was another thing that both Greet and Catalanja would have experienced, and that was a couple years after the Keith Indian War. They're trying to get back on their feet. There's so many people without homes. They're trying to provide for all, just trying to take care of each other. And they had a really bad summer. It just was cloudy all summer. There's like, I don't, it just, so crops were not growing. They didn't have a lot of food stored up. So then people end up being hungry. A lot more people died. But the reason why that was is because there were two big volcanoes that went off around the world that year. And so it's called the year without a summer. And there just wasn't enough light to grow very much food. So that was a really slim winter after, 3 years of war, which I think is really harsh timing for them. But again, that would have been something that Greet went through, and worried. And why does the sky look this way? They didn't know it was a volcano. They didn't know why there were clouds. Um, but they had to, they suffered from that. So there, like I said, there was a lot more deaths, and there was not many crops that were grown.
Mm-hmm. And they fished. Yes.
They did lots of fishing, shellfish, regular fish. Yeah, there were lots of fish that they were able to get. Um, Looking at some years comparing Greet and Catalanja in, was it 1653, is I think about the time that Greet moved to the Wyckoff house. Am I right on that?
Yeah. Around 1652, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
So she moved there, and that year, Catalanja and her husband had traded 300 acres, on the Brooklyn side of things. They couldn't move there though because they were still reeling from the Keefe Indian Wars. There was still, really bad blood between the natives, so they were not able to move that year, but they did move the next year. One thing about thinking about how they moved, and again, Greet would have gone through this, and so did Catalanja. So going across the Oust River or the East River, there was one way to get across, and that was Cornelius Dirksen. He had a ferry, and he purchased land on both sides of the river, and he left horns, a horn that you could blow on each side of the river. And so he would work on one side of the river, which I don't know how you would hear actually the horn on the other side of the river. It's a really wide river. But when he'd hear the horn, he would go, he would sail his ferry over there, and you'd pay him a small amount of wampum, and he would sail you to where you needed to go. So thinking about Greet and Catalanja moving, they're going to move on a ferry. And you ride on the ferry with whoever is there. Sometimes it's a load of pigs, sometimes it's wood, sometimes it's a few people, sometimes the water is really rough because it's a tidal river. So, you might get wet, one of your kids might fall in. And again, how much stuff could you really move that way? That would be really difficult.
Yeah.
Catalanja and Joris had land, they had the land for like 2 years before they actually moved over there. And so what they did is they would cut firewood from there and bring it over to New Amsterdam, but just a ferry load at a time. And I don't even know how you would do that. It just seems very difficult. And it seems a scary way to move. You're not going to be able to bring a lot of things with you, from
Mhm.
your previous home. Um, yeah, 1654 is when Catalanja moved over there officially. And then in 1655, we have another war, an Indian war. It's the Peach Indian War. This is with the Susquehannock, and it was in New Amsterdam area. And so with that, what happened is a Native American, some guy woke up I don't remember his name, but anyway, he woke up, he saw a young native woman eating peaches from his tree and shot her. And then that, of course, causes a lot of problems. So the natives retaliate because, again, their land's all being taken. Um, and it caused a war for probably a good year. There was really a lot of violence there. This happened in the fall, so a really bad time to lose your house and all your food storage for the winter. But there were countless homes destroyed. Settlers were coming down to Fort Amsterdam and hiding in the fort just to try to be safe, to have something to eat. So again, Greet and Catalanja would have experienced that. Neither of them were in New Amsterdam at the time. They were across the river, but word would have traveled to them. They would have heard what was going on. And so thinking about how the women helped each other then and how women needed women really a lot back then, I think they would have helped. I think they would have invited people into their homes and said, you can just spend the winter with us. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any documentation that Greet did that, but I think that she would have reached out and helped wherever she could, either with food or animals, because both Greet and Catalanja had stuff by then. They had land and they had homes and they had orchards and gardens, and so they would have been able to share. But that would have been a difficult, just a difficult thing to worry about. Okay, is this war going to be as long as the last one? How can I help people that are suffering? What can I do to take away some of their pain? A couple years after that, we start to get pirates in New Amsterdam. So, anyone who's been a parent, you just don't want negative influences, gun smuggling and everything going on in your backyard. But this was going on. So again, as a mother, that would be a little worrisome to know that this was going on near your neighborhood. Then in 1664, of course, there was the English takeover. And the Dutch were smart enough to know, um, we don't want to fight you. We can't fight you. We have no military. We have really no weapons. So you can take us over. Just let us stay in our homes, because the English would have destroyed their lands, destroyed their homes, taken them prisoner. Who knows what they would have done. So the Dutch just kind of, set back where they were at. A lot of them were kind of kicked out of their positions. They said, well, you can't be the head of trade anymore. You can't be the head of the government anymore. But then after about a year, the English had to reinstate them into their places because someone would come to trade and say, well, I want to talk to Mr. Van Stuyverson or something, that some Dutch name. Well, he's not doing that anymore. I'm Mr. Jones and I'm the one that's working on this. Oh, well, I don't really know you and I don't want to trade with you, so I'll just sail on down the coast. And so they started losing a lot of business. And so they put the Dutch back into their places of leadership and places of influence so that they could keep the colony going as a successful trade. I think Dutch was spoken clear until like the mid 1800s. It was the main language of New York, which is really crazy. So when they were taken over, not too much changed for them. They had different leadership, but it didn't change too much. And then over the next 10 years, it goes back to the Dutch and then it goes back to the English. And so again, that's got to be kind of unsettling for both of those women to just not know what's going to happen next. Who's going to be in charge? Who do we have to listen to? That sort of thing would be difficult.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm aware of our time and we should begin to bring closure here to this. And if there's anything you want to sum up with before we say.
Well, one thing that I think is great that you're doing is that you meet together, the Wyckoff cousins, we need to keep these stories alive. These people are so inspiring. They were hardworking, they were determined, they were courageous. All the things that they did, because we all go through difficult times. And, sometimes you'll have things going on in my life and I'll think, yeah, but Catalanja did this, you know, and I think you can think back too at the same thing and say, well, Greek did this, she made it through this. And so, yeah, these stories just can't be forgotten. We need to remember who these people were and yeah, and keep those stories alive with people.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. So true. Melissa wants, well, I'll let you say that in a minute. Oh, in the meantime, what's the best place to get the book? The book will be for sale through the Wyckoff house, but in the meantime, what's the best place?
Yeah, so
You can get it on Amazon.
yeah, you can get it on Amazon, you know, Kindle or hard copy. I have a blog, so if you, I don't know if you want to listen to my ramblings, you can subscribe to my blog. It's free. It's historicalslant.com. And so you can order, I'll check and make sure you take it right in the thing. It is, and it's free to subscribe. I usually do like 2 to 3 blogs a month. A lot of them are about New Netherland. A lot of them are just my musings about old cool history things. But you can buy a book, an autographed book from me there. You can also order it on Barnes and Noble, or you can order it from Ingram Spark. So any of those are options.
Mhm.
And if you want to connect with me, historical slant, yes. So if you want to connect to me, my email is there on the website, you on my website, and I will email you back. I mean, I really love talking about New Netherland and history. So if you just want to reach out, if you have any other questions, I would be willing to communicate with you. I would love to hear from you.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Again, round of applause. Thank you so much for being with us today. This has been just so informative and really given us a glimpse of what it was like to live back in the day in New Amsterdam. So,
Yeah, thanks for having me.